Alright guys, welcome back to another video. So in this one we're going to be doing something, or working with material per se, that's different than I've worked with before. So we're building a dresser slash changing table out of hard maple. Now this isn't just any dresser slash changing table, this is the dresser slash changing table for my soon-to-be nephew. So this is a very interesting project because I haven't ever really worked in hard maple before. The hardest material I've ever built furniture out of is hickory, and when I did that, it was only a simple top. So working with this material was remarkably challenging. Now, the only real trick when working with a wood like hard maple is to just take everything a lot slower. You need to be a lot more patient and really take your time to make sure that things work out properly. The other thing I found was really interesting about hard maple is the amount of figure and character to the wood that I never really would have expected. Now, my opinion of hard maple has always been that it's a super light colored wood that is just not very appealing to me. But when I actually started cutting into it, and at the very end when I finally got some oil on it, I found that it was actually a really beautiful wood in a lot of ways. Now again, I still don't particularly like it. Even now, I wouldn't personally make a maple piece of furniture for myself, but I definitely see some nice uses for it. So the whole design of this dresser is based around it being a changing table first off. So compared to your typical dresser, this is going to be a lot shorter. It's only about 36 inches tall. You're at your typical height for a countertop, but it also has a lot of storage room. There's going to be 4 levels of drawers, 3 large drawers on the bottom, and then 2 smaller separated drawers on the top. And so this whole thing is built with mortise and tenon joinery, which again makes it absolutely overkill for what it is, but I want to make sure that this thing is as strong as possible. When my sister lays my little nephew on this thing, I don't want it to come apart, so I made sure that every mortise and tenon on here was a super good, strong fit, and again, this thing is built like a tank. And so I only used 1/4 inch mortises on here because that's all I had access to at the time, but I think that they'll be plenty strong enough. Again, mortise and tenon joinery is stronger than pretty much any other form of joinery. Dominoes, dowels, whatever. True mortise and tenon is about as strong as it gets. And so the trick that I found for doing mortise and tenon joinery the best and the easiest way is to use a dado stack and a mortiser. Again, 2 fairly expensive tools that a lot of people don't have access to. But if your goal is to do mortise and tenon joinery on a lot of projects, these 2 tools will make the job so much easier. Because a mortiser leaves a nice square mortise, you don't have to go back in and chop it out and clear it up like you do when you're using a router, but it also just makes the job a lot easier. Same thing with the dado stack. You could do the same thing with a normal FTG blade. You guys have seen me do that in the past, and it always is, it gives a decent amount of result, but it's nowhere near as good as a dado stack where you can clear out the material in a couple passes. And so where you can see the side frame starting to come together here. And now I built this in a multi-level frame so that it was easier to put a floating panel in here. If you try to tie a floating panel into 8/4 side, post legs like we got on this piece, it's a lot more challenging than if you just have a 3/4 inch piece that you're tying the frame into. And so speaking of that floating side panel, I wanted to get a little bit fancy with it. So my sister wanted to keep this dresser fairly simple, fairly, not complex looking. So we were going to stick with all maple, but to get a little bit fancy with the side panel, I made sure to make it book matched, just again because I can. I have a good quality bandsaw that allowed me to resaw these pieces, these 4/4 pieces, exactly in half, and gave me 2 perfectly sized panels to fit into the side panels of this dresser. And so the one trick when you're dealing with book match panels is that they generally are going to need to be sanded. And so, especially when you're working with maple, again, I mentioned this in other videos before, but maple needs to be sanded in a lot of cases. So we have a lot of chaotic grain in it, and so working with these book match side panels, I really had no choice but to sand them, but they still came out looking absolutely beautiful. One of the nice things is because of the hardness of maple, even with sanding, it still picks up a really beautiful sheen to it. And so to make these panels really, feel good in this space, I used a cove profile bit to just create a little bit of a relief look to these side panels. Now again, I've used this cove profile a lot before, and I love the look it gives. It's probably my favorite look. There's a lot of other profiles you can put on these panels, but I think that the cove is, just the most elegant in my opinion. And so you can see how this construction comes together. We have a panel that then mounts into our legs. This gives a very, very strong built side panel. Then once we had the side panels together, we could start working on the front and the back. And so on the front, I wanted these flat or horizontal stretchers to go across. So I had to cut my tenons across the post legs. So this is not really what a mortiser is designed to do, but my mortiser in specific is designed fairly well to handle it, because you can just sneak that fence forward just enough at a time to cut those long grain mortises. And so you can see here that as I was putting in the long stretchers, I had to cut a small notch out of the tenon. This is purely because our front stretchers and our side stretchers lined up, and so we just had to cut a little notch to make some clearance room. And so after cutting that little notch in there, I could then add a groove to all of our side stretchers that will actually be the support for all our drawers. Our drawers aren't actually going to be riding on any of the other parts, they're just going to be riding on a little runner we're going to be attaching to those side runners. And so with the notches in place, I could start putting the whole thing together in a dry assembly. And so with the dry assembly, making sure everything fit up nicely, I could then move into the little bit more intricate stuff on the inside. So between each level of drawer supports, I wanted to make sure to tie these stretchers together as much as possible. And so to add a little bit more support to our drawer shelves, I wanted to make sure that I could make these stretchers as stable as possible. So I added a short stretcher going between the front and the back of the drawer supports to make sure that although these stretchers are in a position where they could easily move up and down and pinch the drawers, by adding this small stretcher in there, it helps eliminate that. Same thing on the top section, I added in a little vertical divider so that we can have two separate drawers. And then again, it was time for another dry assembly. The reoccurring theme with this project was dry assembly after dry assembly, just making sure that everything goes together nicely. And this is one of the big benefits of mortise and tenon joinery, that you can just kind of keep putting stuff together and checking its fit. So before we do the glue up, I decided to go through and pre-finish everything. So wherever possible, I used my low angle jack with a 40 or 50 degree blade and then chamfered all of the corners. Now on this project, I discovered a really cool technique where you add a bunch of different levels of depth to all of your pieces. So how this works is on our posts, we have a chamfer, then on the next level down, so our long stretchers or our side stretchers, they are all just below that chamfer, and this creates a really cool 3D effect to the whole piece. And so with all those in place, with a little bit of finish on there as well, I could go in and start gluing this thing up. Now this was a very easy glue up, and so after I let the side panels set up for about 2 hours, I then came back and glued up the whole thing. Then moving on to the actual drawer pieces, I wanted to keep these as wide as possible. Now I only have a 6-inch jointer, so I couldn't easily make these 8-inch drawers using my jointers. So that's where the router sled came in to pre-flatten these boards as much as possible. Then I could go through, edge joint, clean up the other edge on the table saw, and then finally go through the planer to get them to their perfect thickness for making the drawers. And so for these drawers, we're going to be using a combination of through and half-blind dovetails. We're going to be using all half-blind dovetails on the front to hide the joinery as much as possible. Again, I wanted this dresser / changing table to be a nice, clean, and simple design. So by hiding the dovetails and hiding the joinery, it just makes it a lot easier. Then on the back side, I went with through dovetails just because they are easier. I didn't feel like going through the effort of cutting half-blind dovetails on the back where it really wasn't necessary. There's no need to try and hide the dovetails on the backside because no one's ever going to see it anyway. So through dovetails are just a lot faster and a lot easier to get done. And so what I found while doing this is that even though I'm cutting dovetails, I'm doing hand-cut joinery here, the hard maple didn't really create that much of a difference compared to something like oak, walnut, or cherry that I'm more used to. So there was definitely a little bit of a difference. It took a little bit more time to cut through with the hand tools, but overall, it wasn't that big of a deal. I didn't find that my hand tools were getting dull any sooner, I didn't really break any tools, so that's like always a good thing. And so the real trick with half-blind dovetails is the alignment. Making sure to use this tape trick that you can see in a lot of different woodworking videos really helps you get these things perfectly positioned and aligned. And then to make this job a lot easier, I took a trick from Matt Cremona, which is you start with your half-blind dovetails by cutting to your line. And you want to cut exactly to your line so that you create a good stopping point for a tool we're going to use in just a second here. So before we use that tool, we're going to cut our through dovetails on the back. Again, this is the whole idea of this, is just clearing out the majority of the waste to make our job easier later on. Then before we do anything, we're going to cut the groove that's going to hold the bottom panel. So because we're using half-wide dovetails on the front, we can cut this groove through all of our pieces without worrying. We just have to make sure that that groove lines up with one of our tails. Then we can pull out the Bosch Colt, which is a compact router, and for our half-line dovetails, I'm mainly using this to just clear out the waste. I've got a 1/4-inch upcut spiral bit in there, and it really just works well to just give you a good, accurate baseline. Then you have to go in with a chisel and just clean up the corners, because obviously the round bit can't get into the angled corner, but it works just as well. Same thing on the through dovetails. Again, I pulled out the Colt with a flush trim bit, a very short flush trim bit, and use it to clean up the baseline of the through dovetails. This is such a great way of working because it gives you a much higher degree of accuracy compared to doing it by hand, and it just is generally a lot more enjoyable to do. And so fitting up these dovetails was definitely quite finicky, and they weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But again, the most important thing to remember when you're doing dovetails is that they are a utilitarian joint. More than anything, they are there to make sure that the drawers stay together and stay nice and strong. So if they're not the most beautiful thing in the world, that's fine. You just have to remember that more years of practice that you have, the better they're going to be. I've only been doing dovetails for a little over a year now, and I'm nowhere near perfect yet. I've got a long way to go. But the nice thing about dovetails is that they are very, very easy to glue up. All you have to do is trust your joinery. So again, because I use the router, I know that all my baselines are almost perfectly aligned, so I just have to pound my drawer panels together, put them in clamps for a little while, then I can move on to actually fitting them up. And so when you're fitting up drawer panels, the best thing to do is use a hand plane, because this lets you sneak up on a nice piston fit, which I managed to get on pretty much all these drawers. They slide in and out of this thing absolutely beautifully, way better than I ever could have expected from a solid wood construction drawer. I was expecting them to, catch really easily and just not be very smooth, but in practice, especially once I got some finish on the drawers, they slid in and out super easy. Then it was time to work on the drawer bottoms. So for the drawer bottoms, I again got a little bit fancy with it. Again, it's something that's no one's ever going to see, but it's something that I know that I can take that extra step on. So there's a really interesting difference between 4/4 and 8/4 hard maple. Generally speaking, your 8/4 maple is going to be a little bit of a darker tan color, whereas your 4/4 is going to be more light colored. So I used this to my advantage when making the drawer bottoms and used a frame and panel design with 8/4 maple strips that made up the center panel, and then 4/4 strips that made up the outer frame. This made such a cool effect in the side of the drawers, because even though it's the exact same wood used for all the components, it looks a lot more interesting. There's a lot more detail to it that really stands out. And so again, these are just a simple frame and panel design. It's about as simple as you can go, honestly, because I didn't need them to be anything complicated. There's very small tenons on the long stretchers, and then on our short side pieces, those are what's doing the main holding power for this whole thing. And so the best thing is always to sneak up with a hand plate if you have one, but if not, it's not really hard to get there on the table saw either. And then these drawer bottoms are removable so that in the future, if my little nephew breaks them, they're easy to fix. And so with the drawers finished, I could start working on the tabletop. Now I wanted to keep each board that's going to go into the main panel as wide as possible. And so for this tabletop, I decided to make a breadboard end. Now, this isn't really necessary by any stretch of the imagination. I just think that it looks a lot better. It looks more finished, more completed if you put those breadboard ends on there. It does have the effect of keeping the tabletop flat over years of wood movement and that. but again, not super necessary. Because this thing is going to be screwed to the base, that in and of itself would pretty well keep the top flat. The breadboard ends are just a nice decorative touch in my opinion. And so, if you've never seen breadboard top ends made, or breadboard ends made, it's a very simple process. All you do is cut a groove into these end pieces that you'll then cut mortises into later on. You then have usually an odd number of tenons coming off of the main panel that will then stick into mortises in those end pieces. And the main thing to do here is to make sure that you don't glue the whole piece together. All you're doing is gluing a middle tenon into that end piece, and that will keep everything together. You'll see in a little bit here that I'll also make some dowels to pound into those tenons to keep them aligned properly. And so there's a ton of different ways to go about making breadboard ends. Now, when working with a wide panel like this, if you don't have a large panel table saw, you can easily do it with a router and an upcut spiral bit. And you just have to create this shoulder that you can then cut your tenons into. The most important thing is that it needs to be a proper fit to the groove that you cut into those end pieces. And so you can see here that my tenons are not very wide. They're only about 2 inches wide on these 8-inch wide these 8-inch wide pieces. So they don't need to be super big, but they do need to be about a quarter of the length. And so then I can go through and clamp this thing under a lot of pressure with my pipe clamps and drill the dowel holes. The important thing here is to elongate the outer 2 dowel holes on your tenons to make sure that they have room for wood movement. If you don't do this, it can very easily and very quickly make your tabletop panel crack. And so you can see here that I'm only applying glue to that middle tenon. This will make sure that that part is what is holding that breadboard end piece tightly to the main panel, but also is also allowing for wood movement around it. And so for the dowels on this piece, I want to try and keep the wood looking as light as possible, but also add a little bit of contrast. So I use some specifically walnut sapwood dowels. That way they are a much lighter color compared to normal walnut, and the effect actually came out pretty well. So the important thing with breadboard ends is to leave the end pieces about 1 inch to 2 inches long. This makes it so that you can take them off fairly easily. But once you have it all glued together, you need to go back in and clean those up. So it's very easy to do with a hand plane, it's nothing really to stress about. And then once you have that all together, again, because of the complexity of the grain of maple, it's best to go through and sand this panel. And so with it all sanded up to a really high 220 grit finish, I then went around with a 1/4 inch round over and put a really good deep round over the whole, all 4 sides of this thing and on both the top and bottom. This will make sure that my little nephew never gets hurt by this tabletop.